Life is a quest for logic and reason. It is a quest to find balance between science and faith. Life is a quest for knowledge and understanding. But most importantly, it's a quest for personal discovery. Whatever your quest, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Welcome to Quest. Hi, Lyn. Welcome to the Quest podcast.
Hi, Todd. It's really good to be here.
Thanks for taking the time today. This is sort of the last celebratory 10 episodes before I hit my 100th episode, so I'm glad you could be part of that. It's been a great season, a great year, and I was really lucky that your publicist slid into my emails to want to bring you on the show. Although it wasn't Quest, it was for Cult Following, one of my sister shows, but we're on hiatus from that, and I thought I can't miss this opportunity to interview Lyn. So welcome to Quest. Eager to dig into all this today. I'm just going to briefly just give a quick synopsis about you. You are the great-great-granddaughter of Samuel Smith, the brother of Joseph Smith. That's big. That's quite a family.
Yeah, it is, particularly in the Mormon Church, where blood lineage is revered. And in my family was one of the few Mormons related to the Smith family that came west with Brigham Young. The rest of them stayed in Illinois. And so we were kind of considered Mormon royalty and held up as an example to emulate. And that meant being more obedient, devoted, and perfect than your normal Mormon, and performing at very high levels.
Yeah. I want to so for the listeners that aren't really aware of what the Mormons are about, the first thing I want to clarify is Mormons versus the term the Latter-day Saint movement. Tell me about that. Are they, because I always see this, kind of this, the Mormons I want to be referred to as this, or, this, and then you explain that dynamic so the listener isn't confused on it.
Yes, the Mormons is really a nickname, and at one point the Mormons embraced that. The Mormon Church embraced that. That was how they were most frequently known. But recently they've asked to be called the Church of Jesus Christ. They've dropped the Latter-day Saints, and they've dropped referring to themselves as Mormons. That's
interesting. Why? Is that a PR spin on this? Is this just rebranding? Why would you think they would do that?
I don't know what they would answer to that question, but I think it's because they are trying to be seen as a Christian religion, not a cult. And also it moves them away from a big part of their identity, which is the Book of Mormon, a text that they consider second to the Bible, that is supposedly the story of the ancestors of the Native Americans on the North and South American continents. And that is under a lot of rebuttal. And I think, in my mind, they want to move away from that and be considered more of a mainstream religion.
Sure. Right. That makes sense. I want to get into your early life in a moment, but I want to ask you a question just sort of about the family tree. I always hear that the Mormons have large families. So obviously you didn't know your great-great-grandfather, but if we looked at each generation down, how many relatives are there? Do you have a lot of brothers and sisters on your end of the tree? And then what about the ancestors, just the generation before? Can you tell me a little bit just briefly about that?
Sure. I'm one of 9 children.
Wow.
My father was one of 10.
Wow.
His father was part of a polygamous family. So he had even more because my great-great-grandfather had multiple wives
Mm.
and multiple children through those marriages.
Wow. Wow. So do you remember, did your father remember Samuel Smith, or had he been long dead by that point? He didn't have any recollection?
No, he died early, and my great-grandfather was orphaned when Samuel Smith was, and this is part of my story in the book, but died shortly after Joseph Smith was murdered by a mob in Nauvoo, Illinois. So a month after that, he was poisoned in a succession to the leadership of the church plot, and Brigham Young became the prophet, the next prophet and leader of the Mormon Church.
Gotcha. You mentioned how many siblings you have. You said you had 10 siblings? Have 10 siblings? 9. Tell me about your early life. What was it like growing up in such a high profile family, and what exactly was your life like? Did you grow up wealthy? Were you in public school? Were you homeschooled? Like, what was that like, that young environment? Because I know things changed dramatically for you when you went to college. Let's talk about pre-college and what that was like.
Well, my father grew up on a large cattle and horse ranch in Wyoming because his father had been sent to settle this part of Wyoming for the Mormon Church. So he grew up on a big ranch in Wyoming and with a very high profile. And when he married my mother and went to school, he became an academic. He ended up got a PhD in Utah history and ended up as the director of the State Historical Society in Utah. And we grew up in Salt Lake City primarily, but we had a ranch 2 hours south of Salt Lake where we would go on the weekends. My father really liked horses, and he also thought that all that ranching hard work was character building for us children. Lots of responsibility and chores.
Where did you fall in the lineup of the 9 brothers and sisters? Are you an older child, younger child? You fall in the middle?
Third to the oldest. I had an older brother and an older sister, and there were twins right after me, a boy and a girl.
Wow, that's incredible. And what for Mormon children, what was your schooling like in that day?
Well, even though there is a substantial number of Mormon kids who are homeschooled, we all went to public school, which is the norm in Utah. The public school system is very good. And so we went to public school, and I planned to attend BYU, Brigham Young University, a Mormon college. But I graduated a year early from high school intentionally, and I missed the deadline for BYU. So I thought I'd just go to a state university for my first year and then transfer. But of course, something happened to me that first year and changed the trajectory of my life considerably.
Let's talk about that.
Well, I adored a professor who I found out was an atheist, and he was teaching my creative writing class, and he discovered that I was a Mormon and who I was, and challenged me to take his Bible as literature class the following semester, and said I should be prepared to defend my faith. And so instead of going home between the break between semesters, I went to the library and had to order books that were not in the library, that were forbidden for me to read because they were considered dangerous books. But I knew my professor would have read them, so I wanted to read them so I could better mount a defense. However, in the process of reading these books, which were by scholars, historians, um, I realized that the narrative I had learned my entire life was very different than what these historians and scholars were reporting. And they had a lot of evidence that was incredibly convincing. Signed affidavits, newspaper reports, eyewitnesses, and Fawn Brody's book, No Man Knows My History, is still considered one of the definitive books, biographies on Joseph Smith. And it was the first time I understood religion in context, that there were a lot of upstart churches when Joseph Smith was growing up, and a time of religious ferment. And his family believed, as many did at that time, in folklore, spirits, visions, really sort of mysticism and magic. And I understood how he could take knowing his background and generalize it to religion. And he was also had told his neighbors that he had the ability to cast out evil spirits and find buried treasure on their property. And he was in fact arrested for defrauding his neighbors for doing this. And I could see how he could take that leap and then claim that he had found these gold plates in the hills near his farm.
Sure.
That were in fact the record of the Native Americans. And so suddenly everything was logical and made sense to me, and it told a very compelling narrative. And I tried to rebut it in my mind, but I couldn't. And it was like once I had seen the truth, I couldn't unsee it.
Right.
And I was shattered. I did not know what the impact would be. I couldn't imagine telling my parents, after 4 generations of unbroken devotion, that I was not a believer. And in fact, I went so far as to believe that if Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church was a fraud, maybe this whole idea of God itself was a myth and not to be believed. And so I consider myself an atheist.
Wow.
So I went from believer to atheist in about a week's time.
Were you probably 18 years old when this happened?
19.
19. Wow. That's quite a crisis of faith.
It was.
That's big.
And I felt completely lost, and I couldn't understand the jumble of emotions. I felt like I was in one of the pinballs in a pinball arcade game. I was alternately angry at being duped. I felt foolish for being so gullible. I was sad too about the sense of loss. This was something that had made me special and set apart. I mean, they reserved rows in church for my family. And all of a sudden, what had made me special was something that I was ashamed of, because Joseph Smith turned out to be quite a despicable character. Mm-hmm. Predatory womanizer, a liar, a cheat, a fraud.
Yeah. It's interesting to me when I see parallels of things like this. People start poking holes in organized religion or organized spirituality, or whatever it might be, usually using science or some incriminating evidence somewhere. So, and you see this with like the Scientologists. You see people poke holes in what L. Ron Hubbard wrote about, and some of the stuff, it's almost sci-fi sounding when you hear it and you're like, okay, well now, look at it from out here. It seems kind of crazy. I will say, having read Dianetics myself, there are some really good nuggets of things in that book that it took science 50 years to prove, theories he had. But a womanizer, pretty sure he might have been he might have hated his mother. I think he had like real problems with women in general. Like there's certainly a lot of those things that you see in the book that's even beyond where our souls came from or how we might have made our way to the planet. And like that stuff that it sounds like bad science fiction in a way. So certainly, I think even when I was a boy, for transparency here, my listeners know, but I'm 54 years old, and I remember, being in school with Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, and how weird it was that mostly a Christian community, that some of their customs and beliefs and things like that were so odd and seemed so backwards to me, and it was very, very weird situation. I grew up in very southern Indiana. And there were thousands of churches, like on every corner, like crazy. And actually headquarters for 3 international religions that are very cult based. So It's a very weird, like that part of the Bible Belt is just so odd in its mix of what there is. So I grew up around that. So I've always found all this stuff very fascinating. So you subsequently left the church because of this crisis of faith. That's accurate?
That's correct.
And when you did that, was it just one of these situations where you show up for family dinner and they're like, hey, did you go to church on Sunday? And you're like, no, and you kept it on the down low? Or were you like, did you have a coming out party for, I'm done with this, and told everyone? How did that go for you?
Well, when I stopped going to church and stopped going to Mormon social events, the church came looking for me, and they knew who I was, and
Gotcha.
they sent visiting teachers to check up on me. And these women, the Mormon women and men, are called brother and sister in the Mormon faith, and they wanted to know where I had been. And I confessed to them that I was no longer a believer, and that's why I wasn't going to church. And they were appalled and shocked, and I think felt a little responsible, perhaps, because they alternately pleaded with me to return and threatened me with, eternal damnation. And I knew that it would get back to my parents. So I had to make an emergency phone call. This was before FaceTime or anything, and break the news to my parents, who were shocked and devastated. And I was really close to my father. I was his favorite and sort of the golden child in my family, a high achiever. And he had always told my younger brothers and sisters, look at what happens when Lyn follows God's plan and is dedicated and devoted and works hard. She's rewarded. And suddenly that story wasn't true anymore. And my mother said, you're the reason we're not going to be together in heaven as a family. I mean, she was beyond hurt. And she made me promise that I would keep an open mind and continue to pray that the truth would be revealed to me.
Looking back, I'm sorry I just want to insert this real quick. Looking back, would it have been fair to allow the church its own rebuttal to the things that you uncovered or thought about, or having the crisis of faith? Would it have been worth it to have them say, hey, let's address this one-on-one so we can have you back? Or was it just the information you had, there was just no way you could even hear it?
Well, I couldn't imagine that they could rebut some of the facts. There were too many too many lies, too many discrepancies. Everything from what I had learned is that you went to the temple. Mormons have places of where secret ceremonies and rituals take place. And I was told these were based on that Joseph Smith had been revealed them as King Solomon's temple rituals. And then I found out he copied them from the Masons. And so there was just incident after incident. It was
Right.
just too much to rebut.
Right. Right. I get it. I get it. And ultimately, were you excommunicated kind of from your family and your friends and your spiritual community? Is that what happened next?
Well, I was shunned by my friends. And I mean, it was almost like they thought I was contagious. And also warned that I was going to be a daughter of perdition and in eternal darkness forever. My family didn't disown me or cut me off, but I didn't take any money from them after that. I decided I was going to be independent. I knew I was bringing shame to the family.
Yeah.
The church didn't excommunicate me, largely, I think, because it would have been an embarrassment for them.
Right.
So I wasn't excommunicated. But I knew I had no place in Utah anymore. And with my family, I was persona non grata. There was no role for me. And every family event was so intricately interwoven with church that it was a constant presence that here was this disbeliever among the faithful. And so I moved. I went to New York City sight unseen when I graduated from college. And it's not an accident that it was 2,000 miles away. I had the idea that I could shed my skin like a snake and just emerge shiny and new in this big city of anonymity. And I could put my whole Mormon past behind me. But what I found out is that with religious trauma and indoctrination, it's a long process to unpack and
For sure.
deconstruct. And I wasn't able to leave it behind as quickly as I wanted.
Yeah. Yeah. That is typical. You see people make big dramatic moves like that. People will move to L.A. They'll move to New York, and there's positives to that, to be in a big city like that, and also probably to go to New York City is about as far away from Mormonism as you could possibly get, And
Exactly.
it would be like leaving like Scientology's headquarters in LA and moving to Boise, Idaho, where you were probably spot as far away from Scientology as you could get.
Right. I knew no other Mormons in Manhattan.
It is also dangerous in a way too, because sometimes, because there is an indoctrination in you, you can easily fall into other traps and other things. And that's what you get sometimes is, I grew up Catholic in Indiana, and, to go to LA, it's the lure of Scientology. It's on every street corner. You can't go down Hollywood Boulevard without seeing a building that says the L. Ron Hubbard something, or people passing out flyers, or come on into this, or a museum that's really just a front for learning about Scientology. And you go in as a tourist thinking, so sometimes it's easy to fall into other traps when you make those moves, because again, like you said, the indoctrination is still in you. So it's hard to escape that. And I think that's an interesting point. You're not the, go ahead.
You haven't developed critical thinking skills. You've been listening to a voice outside of you for so long about what you're supposed to think and feel that you are not in touch with your own sense of self. It's a very weak sense of self initially that you don't fully trust. So I can see how naively you could fall into other cults or religions or organizations that would be just as destructive.
For sure.
Uh, Luckily, I didn't go down that path.
You're not the only one that broke away from the church. Your sister did too. Is that right?
Yes, but in a very different way.
Was
She
it around
was
the same time as you, or
yes, she was kicked out of the house.
hmm,
Um, she was rebelling since she was 14 in a way that was just beyond what my parents could imagine or control. She ran away from home. She drank. She smoked. She was promiscuous. Um, and eventually, my father kicked her out of the house at 17 and said, I'm not going to let one bad apple spoil the rest of the barrel. And that had a real impact on me. I kind of doubled down on being a good girl after that because it never occurred to me that my parents were capable of throwing away the bad apple. And that scared me. And, but she and I were only 15 months apart. She was my older sister. And we were very close, and we stayed in close even after she had been kicked out of the house secretly. Um, and she married a sugar daddy, 20 years her senior, and moved to San Francisco and to pursue her dreams of becoming a blues singer. And I was on the opposite coast. So, but in spite of our distance, geographically, we stayed in touch because we were the only outliers. Uh, Even though our reasons for leaving were very different. She was like a nihilist. She was, it's a random universe. She was very comfortable with her being an atheist and said, there are no rules, nothing matters, do what you want, a very hedonistic approach to life. And I was like, well, there's got to be a reason we're on the planet. I was a searcher, and I wanted to know. I experienced a lot of existential angst for the fact that there was didn't seem any reason uh, for my existence, and I kept looking for what that might be.
yeah, yeah. You've authored the book "We Were Smiths: Escaping the Shadow of Joseph Smith's Mormon Legacy." Now, you've written this. This isn't out yet, but you've written this book, and I'm assuming there's a whole lot of additional stuff. I want people to read the book, so we don't have to go through the whole book in this interview. But tell me a little bit about what this book is going to cover when it comes out. How much of your life? What do you want to talk about in particular that you're most proud of with writing this book?
Uh, well, I think the book tells a story. It's eye opening, I think, for people who think they understand the Mormon Church because I share what I learned about the Mormon Church and the reasons I felt like I had to leave. And some of it is not common knowledge. But I think what ultimately happened is that my family really divided over this issue. Decades after my sister and I left, some of my other brothers and sisters left, another brother and another sister. And this divided the family, and it was a very divisive. And I'm hoping that ultimately my memoir is a story of hope because, in spite of our differences, in spite of how radically uh, opposite we were on so many levels about religion, we found a way to build a very fragile bridge of connection between the heretics and the believers that allowed us to be a family and be in each other's presence. So that even though we were initially estranged, my sister and I, from my family, ultimately we were able to reconcile, and a lot of healing took
Yeah.
place.
So we were Smiths. This is a family story then, this book.
Yes.
And if you don't mind me asking, are your mom and dad still alive?
No, my mother passed last year, my father 2 years before that, at 92 and 90.
Yeah.
And they, I kind of waited until they were gone before pursuing publication.
Sure, of course, yeah. And of the remaining brothers and sisters, is everyone out of the church at this point, or is it still split?
Very split, half and half.
Yeah. And of their kids, how many are interested in Mormonism? Is it declining with the next generation? Like I think you have kids, right?
Right. My kids obviously are not Mormons, and are fascinated with their Mormon cousins, but much to their surprise, the kids all started out as devout Mormons. Some of them were homeschooled even as an extra layer of protection against leaving the church. And shockingly, most of my brothers and sisters, Mormon brothers and sisters, kids have left the church.
Gotcha. I still have a few more questions left for this interview, but these next two are probably the biggest two that I really want to ask you. The first one, Lyn, are you religious or spiritual today, or is it all gone?
No, I'm spiritual. I had an experience, which I talk about in the book, that led me to believe that I was really missing out on understanding the bigger mystery of life in defining myself as an atheist. That there was something bigger than myself that existed, that whether it's the creative design of the universe, the source, love, the divine. I hesitate to call it God because God has such Judeo-Christian connections to it.
Sure.
But I'm very spiritual, and I feel that I don't have to have the answers. I'm content with the mystery.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how it all works and what happens after we die, for example, but whether we retain individual consciousness or not. But I really do feel that love is something that can't be explained. I think we are hardwired for God.
Yeah.
I think there's a part of us that want to be good people, and there really isn't a scientific explanation for that.
Right. The second question I have is, would you call the Mormons a cult?
This is going to be very controversial, but yes, I would. I would, even though most people think of cults as being small groups with a charismatic leader, and Joseph Smith's early church clearly would have been classified a cult, but it has grown. There are almost 18 million Mormons worldwide, and because of its size, it has legitimacy.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
And that, however, does not negate, when you look at cults and you're looking at the characteristics of cults, the characteristics of an inappropriate loyalty to a leader. I mean, I can't tell you how sad it is to me when families choose their church over their kids if they come out as gay or transgender or something. And sort of isolating members, penalizing them if they are a part of the world. We're not supposed to be, as Mormons, part of the world. The absolute authoritarianism, the lack of financial transparency, and complete intolerance for questions, and and a sense of perpetually inadequate. You can never be good enough.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that um, it's a very patriarchal church. Women are not in leadership positions and really don't have a legitimate role that's recognized other than wife and mother, and particularly mother. They call it the Mother of Zion syndrome. And what I mean is that regardless of your individuality, that's the only role available to you. And women in Utah have the highest rate of antidepressant use in the country.
Mm. I'm actually going to bring that up in just a second. I wanted to, before I bring that up though, I want to ask you, it appears like the highest concentration of Mormons are in Utah. That's accurate to say, right?
Correct.
How much control do they have in a state like that? Are there Mormons in the government there? Do they have control over legislation? Are they powerful enough to set policies? Did you ever witness any of that or hear of any of that? I'm always curious when this is like the Vatican in Italy, there's a tremendous amount of influence and power. Did you see that in Utah?
Completely.
Mm-hmm.
The Mormon Church runs Utah.
So so
I mean, you cannot get elected with the vast majority of people living in Utah being Mormons if you're not a Mormon.
Yeah.
And you also can't be successful in business either. I mean, it's brother so-and-so and sister so-and-so. And they absolutely impact every level. I mean, Utah doesn't have liquor by the drink, for example. You can't go into a bar and order a drink. You have to be part of a club. They
wow.
have really put their stamp on everything that happens in Utah.
And that's dangerous.
It's very dangerous. Yeah. And it's also when a church has no accountability, but it operates in politics and in business. I think, Wall Street was shocked when the Washington Post came out with that article 2 years ago that said that the Mormon Church had a $100 to $200 billion private equity fund that was being used inappropriately, i.e. not for charitable reasons, but to prop up and buy more Mormon businesses. That came as a real big shock to people. They had no idea of the wealth. But the Mormon Church is the second wealthiest church in the world, Christian church in the world.
After the Vatican, probably. After the Vatican Bank.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the biggest private landowner in the United States.
Wow. Well, it's always interesting to hear that financial aspect of things, because the Vatican Bank, very powerful bank in Europe, the Catholics, which make up the majority of the Christians, at 52% of Christians are Catholics. It's acquired a vast amount of real estate and money over time. In fact, in New York City, you can see all the prime spots where there's still Catholic churches, and you're like, man, that property is worth so much money. Never get any problems. Just going to sell that one little parcel off and you gold. But also, like, it's also interesting to me, like the YMCA is the largest nonprofit company in the United States. Nonprofit company. It operates on $4 billion in revenue every year. The YMCA does. A lot of people don't realize that. Yeah. And I think people think of the YMCA today much differently than they thought about it 50 years ago or farther back. But people think of the YMCA as a gym that you join. Right. But it didn't really start that way, but that's what it's become, and still a nonprofit. And so there's just so much money in these religions and
organizations,
or these different religious organizations, and supporting things, and so many ways to sift money all over,
Yes.
It's nuts. I mentioned Scientology earlier because I think when people make cult comparisons, they always tend to lean toward what the Scientologists are doing, And, Scientology, it's interesting because there's so many people in the entertainment industry that are Scientologists because it appealed to them for so long. And even today, people are like, Tom Cruise is the biggest star in the world. How could he be in a cult? That's what people think, right? How could that guy be in a cult?
Right.
Like, it just doesn't make any sense to me.
It legitimizes the cult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They're the perfect flagship members in a way to turn people on to joining it. And then, you start to see that as Scientologists took positions of power within the entertainment industry, they were only hiring Scientologists. Right. And that's how there was. And what's really interesting about the entertainment industry is it was so Jewish controlled for so long. And now, like, they're really losing their market share in their influence in entertainment, and it's being taken over by people in the Church of Scientology, which has no sign of going away.
Right.
It's become that church is 50 years old now. Like, people don't realize that, 50 years becomes 100 years really quick. Right. And you start to have members born in,
Right.
And that's where these things set in. Yeah. And then one day you just go, hey, they're a religion like anyone else. Like,
exactly. And the Mormon Church has spent a lot of money cultivating an image of mainstream Christian, a mainstream Christian religion. And they run ads, about what a wholesome, family-focused religion it is. But, I want to say, well, yeah, let's talk about the fact that you have no people of color in the church. Women have no positions of leadership or influence. Where are your gay and transgender kids? The misfits. I mean, it's always just this very homogenized white middle class, I call it Wonder Bread, Utah look.
Yeah. It's and this really spins off into maybe a different topic, but I'll jump into it with you. But, I think people want to be around and find a group that they're comfortable with. And that's what you see when you pick a home to live in. You want to live in a certain subdivision and be around kind of your people. Like, you might want to, and I'm not saying this to be at any kind of racial overtone at all with this, but like, you move into a subdivision, a middle-class subdivision, and you're fine that there's 2 black families. But at one point, if the scales tilt a little bit too much where you start to feel uncomfortable, even if the 2 black families are on either side of your home, it makes people feel uncomfortable. People have moved out of neighborhoods because there were only 2 black households on the street, but they happen to move in next door to you, and you move. That's how awful people are. And they will find the religion that suits them. They'll find the cult that suits them. They'll find the gym down the street that suits them better because they want to be around a certain people. Women around women, white men around white men, black men around black men. Whatever. People find their tribes. And this is why we have these problems that are generational in this country. And me growing up in the Midwest, people say, oh, you moved to LA, moved to New York. It's so liberal in these. You can be anything and do anything you want. Go to Atlanta. It's all, so open. I tell you, people say, oh, racism's ending. It's not ending. All you have to do is go to Kentucky and Mississippi and different places and look and see, because once you get a county or 2 counties or 3 counties away from the county that Atlanta is in or the county that Louisville, Kentucky is in, you realize that people, they have the political ideals of their father, who had the political ideals of their father, and this is why you have these generational issues. People are a fan of this university because their dad was. They're in this church because their dad was. They're racist because their dad called these people names. This will never end.
Correct.
These big cities and these big religions and things will stay the way they are forever because there just isn't going to be change.
Right. I was shocked when I moved to the South after New York City, and I live in Savannah, Georgia.
I love Savannah.
It's a wonderful town. It's quirky. It's accepting. It's very tolerant, but there is still a level of segregation, I guess, that is shocking to me.
You know what I'm talking about with Georgia.
Yeah.
Yeah, you go 2 counties away, and it's different in Macon.
Absolutely.
That's the halfway point to Atlanta, right there. It's like Macon, I think, and
It
yeah,
is.
it's a different place. And it's very interesting. You mentioned this because what people don't realize is Atlanta is the largest city in the South. It's the New
Right.
York of the South. You drew a line across the country. Atlanta
Absolutely.
is the big city, and people don't. And I've spent a lot of time in Atlanta. I worked in the movie industry for a long time and did a lot of things there. And I love Savannah. Was in it for 6 months one time for a project, and definitely in always one of the top 5 cities I would move to and spend the rest of my life at. The
Right.
Spanish Moss, to be on the ocean, to be on the river there,
Beautiful.
downtown district, all the squares. You really, really realize why the city was spared during the Civil War, because it was just so beautiful. You just had to,
Right.
how could we burn this?
Right.
Incredibly historical city. But what people don't realize with Atlanta is Atlanta has actually the highest percentage of African American gays than anywhere else in the country, because it's a sanctuary city. So imagine how hard it is to be black in the South, much less be gay and black in the South.
Right.
It's fascinating, and I did not realize that. And it's really the same thing as being white and gay, and why San Francisco was so appealing, and why so many
Right.
people went to San Francisco, because this was the only place you could really be tolerated in the whole country.
Right.
And so it's really, Georgia is a very interesting state in a number of ways, but you just go 2 or 3 counties away, and it's plantations and peanut farms, and it's generational farmer families, and and they
Absolutely.
may have 4 or 5 kids, and 2 of them say, I'm getting out of the farm and I'm moving to Atlanta, or I'm moving across the country, but the rest of them stay, and it just breeds the same thoughts: anti-gay,
Right.
anti-black, anti-Asian, like whatever.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
crazy. So
Yeah.
there's Todd's rant of the episode and his cup is half empty point of view that I always bring into it, because I think people would like to have the optimism to think that this world
It's
could be
all
great.
changing everywhere. Right.
It's just, you have to be aware of how it happens, and it's really tough. And I think people see this in elections a lot when they go, these big cities, like why they can't have the power to elect a president. It's very dangerous, and why we have the electoral college system is because you could have enough popular vote in Chicago, New York, and LA to sway an election, and you can't win an election that way, because so many of my friends, these are the only cities they've ever known. And I said, if you really want to see how this country is, you really need to travel out to Iowa and Indiana and Ohio and
Indiana.
see the
Yeah.
country,
Oh,
like to see how the rest of the country is. So maybe you have a better understanding or perspective. I don't want it to sway your opinion, but I want you to understand why things are the way they are.
right.
And we see it in religion, and we see it in politics, and we see it in race, and all of that. That's what they say. You can't win a conversation about, race and religion and politics. Those are 3 things you can't talk about.
Well, in my family, we don't talk about religion or politics for the same reason, uh, because there's really no way to talk about something that was traumatic to me and it's sacred to you.
Hmm.
I mean, there's no place to join there, or
So
and it's,
polarized.
and it's so polarized. And I think that's true. I heard an alarming statistic that 27% of young people under the age of 30 are estranged from a family member. And that seems really high. And I know politics are part of it. But we learned to really try to find the common ground. Where are we're parents now, some of us are grandparents, and what connects us, and beliefs and values can be very, very similar, uh, and we're more alike than we are different.
For sure. You wrote a blog on your website that I want to bring up. And you wrote about the unspoken struggle of depression among Mormon women. Let's talk about that a little bit, because I do want to bring this up. What's the struggle? Why?
Well, I mean, I can use my mother's story as an example. I mean, she had a real gift, her voice, and studied uh, music, took music lessons her whole life, and she won a scholarship to Juilliard. And however, my father entered the picture. They began dating, and at 19, she married him and gave up her scholarship and her plans to become an opera singer. And with the encouragement of her mother, her mother said, Marlene, my mother's name, um, he's a Smith. This is an unbelievable, rare occurrence, an opportunity you just can't pass up. And always keeping your eye on eternal salvation. And that was like a golden ticket to heaven, I guess.
Hmm.
But what happens, I think, is that the limited options for expression, for maybe the idea of a big family is not something that appeals to you. You are honored and revered based on the number of children you have. And for example, if Sister Anderson across the street from you has 3 more kids than you do, and she seems to be juggling all the balls in the air just perfectly, or sews her own kids' clothes, has always got the best items at the bake sale, whatever, and you've only got 3 kids, and you're feeling like your life is falling apart and you're miserable. Unfortunately, you don't think, why am I in this situation? You think, what's wrong with me? Why am I not happy? And why am I not doing a better job? After all, if she can do it, I can do it. I call that the mother of Zion syndrome.
Wow. That's brilliant.
Well, it is what I've seen firsthand. And I've got brothers and sisters who are living those lives and fairly what I would consider unfulfilled, because they're such bright, intelligent, capable people.
That is an interesting perspective on that. I think that's really brilliant, Lyn. Really.
Well, I am, and I think that the environment is sexist to begin with. I mean, there are statements that are made by politicians in Utah that would raise, hairs on the back of somebody's neck in any other state. Like, women were asked to answer a questionnaire. Do you think men or women would make a better president, or something along those lines? And the women even said men are more capable than women, would be better. So it's internalized sexism.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I'm curious about this large family aspect of things. It seems incredibly expensive. It's the world we live in today. Things are so expensive that people have pared down. I just have a brother, like this 2 kids. So how do you do 9? How do you do 9 or 10 in this day and age? Like, is this still happening with the Mormons, that they have so many kids?
Not probably as many. It's more rare to have 9 or 10 kids, but 4 or 5, yeah, that's
incredible.
A typical Mormon family. So what happens is that women are working because it requires 2 incomes. But they are not working in careers. They're taken advantage of in the workforce because they don't identify with a career. They often haven't gotten the training, so they're in low-level positions, making money and exploited by the companies that they work for, because they can get cheap labor. And these are women who don't want to be the boss. They're already holding down the full-time job as homemaker.
Gotcha. Yeah. And would these be maybe Mormon-owned companies too?
Often. Mm-hmm.
Often. Wow. So I'm curious, moving forward, Lyn, where you're going, because we're going to see this book out in the near future, and I'm wondering, are you like I don't necessarily see you out there in the lecture circuit like hammering the Mormons right now, like we see Leah Remini ripping Scientology to shreds like every moment she can on
Right.
social media and her TV shows. That's not the stance you're really taking here. You escaped it.
No.
You're done. You've healed from it. That's fair to say.
Yes, and my family has healed for it.
Hmm.
The book ends at a certain point in my life, but I've started a second book that starts up where that one left off, and it's much more about my beliefs today, spirituality, what I learned from my journey from a spiritual perspective.
Yeah, yeah. So when you go on your nationwide book signing tour, and someone comes up to you and says, "Can you tell me how I get out of this religion?" What would be your advice to them?
Yeah. Well, get some support because this is very, very hard to do alone. And you are already feeling very alone, especially if you're the only one in your family who is leaving or has left. So I sought therapy, not right away, but eventually I could tell I was in a downward spiral. And I got therapy that helped me unpack both my family dysfunction, but also the religious trauma before it was even labeled religious trauma.
Mm-hmm.
But and join other people who are in the same boat. Find a community where you don't feel so alone, and that you can. And there are lots of online communities, which wasn't available when I was getting out of the church. But ex-Mormon, Reddit, I have a list of resources if you go to my website that I recommend for people who are exiting a cult or a high control religion. And we can put them in the notes too.
Sure.
But I think that's really important and also be patient. It takes time to unpack this stuff and to understand who you are now, what you believe, what is true for you, and also to heal. And I find that even decades after leaving the church, I can still get triggered by something.
Yeah, for sure. Lyn, thank you so much for coming out today. This was such an informative interview. I really appreciate you telling your story and engaging in a good conversation about this today. And everyone, get that book when it comes out. And Lyn, how can people find you out there on social media and the interwebs?
Yes, it's really simple. It's Lyn with just one N. LynSmithGregory.com is my website. And that has a copy of all my blogs and also other podcasts I've been a guest on. And I'm also on Instagram and Facebook under that handle, Lyn Smith Gregory. And I'd love to have you join our community as well.
I would love to. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Metacortex Publishing hopes that you've enjoyed this presentation.
Please take a moment to listen to some other podcast offerings from Metacortex Publishing.
Hi everybody, I'm Amber Rose, the religious hippie, and I host the podcast A Catholic's Perspective. Join me every 2 weeks as I release episodes targeted towards helping young Catholics navigate their ever-changing secular world while staying strong in their faith. Whether you are a Catholic or not, all are welcome here. So if this is something that interests you, feel free to tune in. You can find A Catholic's Perspective on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I hope to see you there. Bye!
The No Earthly Explanation podcast investigates the things that are unexplainable. Hosted by world-renowned investigative researcher Donald R. Schmidt and scientist Ellie Ringo. Follow them as they look for evidence for things that have no earthly explanation. Available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Cult Following is a podcast that studies the personalities and common traits of cult leaders and their followers. Get the real story behind these infamous and oftentimes tragic cults from a new perspective, through exhaustive research, and from interviews with people that were there. Available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fischer and Anthony Smith and is distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure to visit the official website for Metacortex Publishing at metacortexpublishing.com or find us on social media for other unique content.